Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy corridors of medieval monasteries, where centuries of devotion slowly crumbled into abandonment. You can almost hear the ghostly whispers of Gregorian chant echoing through empty stone halls. See the dust motes dancing in coloured light streaming through stained glass windows that once illuminated rows of praying monks. Tonight, you'll discover why these bastions of faith, learning and community service gradually emptied across Europe, leaving behind only ruins and memories. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why so many grand abbeys now stand as tourist attractions rather than living communities. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. I'd love to hear where and when you started watching this video. Or perhaps you could share what draws you to these quiet historical journeys. Your support helps keep these bedtime stories flowing like a gentle stream of knowledge. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the gates of Grand Monastery in the year 1200, watching as dozens of brown-robed figures move purposefully through courtyards, bustling with activity. The air carries the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, herbs from the infirmary garden, and the musty smell of parchment from the scriptorium where monks carefully copy manuscripts by candlelight. This is the golden age of monasticism, when these communities served as the beating heart of medieval European civilization. You witness an institution at its peak power and influence. Monasteries aren't just places of prayer, they're universities, hospitals, hotels, banks, and agricultural centres all rolled into one. The monastery you're observing controls thousands of acres of fertile farmland, operates mills and fish ponds, maintains roads and bridges, and provides the only reliable healthcare for miles around. Peasants bring their sick children to the monastery's infirmary. Merchants store their wealth in the abbey's treasury, and scholars travel from distant lands to study in its library. As you walk through the cloisters, you notice the incredible wealth surrounding you. Golden chalices gleam on altar tables. Intricate tapestries line the walls, and the floors are paved with polished stone imported from distant quarries. This prosperity didn't happen overnight. It's the result of centuries of careful accumulation. Kings and nobles have donated vast estates to secure prayers for their souls, while common people leave small coins and livestock in hopes of divine favour. The monastery has become a medieval corporation, complete with complex accounting systems and international trade networks. You observe the daily rhythm of monastic life as bells mark the hours from dawn to dusk. Monks rise before sunrise for matins, spend hours in prayer, study ancient texts in multiple languages, tend to the sick, teach village children their letters, and manage vast agricultural operations. It's a remarkable balance of spiritual devotion and practical expertise that has made monasteries indispensable to medieval society. The monastery's library alone represents one of the greatest treasures of the medieval world. You run your fingers along shelves lined with chained books, each volume worth more than most peasants will earn in a lifetime. These aren't just religious texts. You discover works of classical philosophy, medical treatises, astronomical observations, and historical chronicles. The monks serve as humanity's librarians, preserving knowledge that would otherwise vanish into the Dark Ages. Every manuscript represents months of painstaking labour, with monks spending entire careers copying and illuminating single books. You step into the monastery's workshop areas and marvel at the diversity of crafts being practiced. In one corner, a monk carefully grinds pigments from precious minerals to create vibrant inks for illuminated manuscripts. Another tends to beehives that provide both honey and wax for candles. The monastery's brewers create ales that are famous throughout the region, and yes, They do sample their work for quality control because someone has to make sure it's not poison. The blacksmith shop rings with the sound of hammers forging everything from farming tools to decorative ironwork for the church. But even in this golden age, you can sense the first hairline cracks in the foundation. Some monks whisper complaints about the increasing complexity of monastery business, longing for the simpler spiritual life their founders envisioned. Historians still argue whether the seeds of monastic decline were already present during these peak years, embedded in the very success that made monasteries so influential. The wealth that allows monks to serve their communities also creates temptations and complications that pure spiritual communities never faced. You notice subtle signs of the challenges ahead. Younger monks sometimes seem more interested in the monastery's wine cellar than its prayer books. Though, to be fair, monastery wine was legendarily good, so you can hardly blame them. The abbot spends more time meeting with bankers and land agents than with his spiritual charges. Visiting nobles treat the monastery like a luxury hotel, expecting fine meals and entertainment that strain both resources and monastic discipline. The economic model seems unshakable as you examine the monastery's financial records. Land grants provide steady agricultural income, while skilled craftsmanship brings in additional revenue. Pilgrims donate generously for the privilege of viewing sacred relics, and the wealthy pay handsomely for the monks' prayers. The monastery operates like a medieval hedge fund, diversifying its investments across real estate, agriculture, manufacturing, and spiritual services. Some monasteries even operate their own merchant fleets, trading goods across Europe and beyond. You witness the monastery's role as a centre of technological innovation. Monks experiment with new agricultural techniques, develop improved methods of food preservation, and create mechanical devices to assist with daily tasks. The monastery's watermill represents cutting-edge technology, grinding grain more efficiently than anything available elsewhere in the region. These practical innovations flow naturally from the monastic emphasis on combining prayer with productive labour. Yet you begin to detect an underlying fragility in this impressive system. The monastery's success depends on maintaining delicate relationships with secular authorities, continued public faith in monastic spiritual power, and the ability to balance worldly prosperity with otherworldly devotion. You sense that any significant disruption to these foundations could have catastrophic consequences. As evening approaches and you hear the bells calling monks to vespers, you realize you're witnessing the calm before a storm. The very elements that make this monastery so successful, its wealth, its political connections, its integration into secular society, will eventually contribute to its vulnerability. The golden age of monasticism is about to face challenges that will test whether these ancient institutions can adapt or will crumble like autumn leaves. You settle into the rhythm of monastic time, where days flow into seasons and seasons into centuries, where the permanent seems eternal until it suddenly isn't. The story of why monasteries were deserted begins here, in their moment of greatest triumph, when success itself planted the seeds of future abandonment. The year is 1347, and you feel the first ominous whispers of change as ships dock at European ports, carrying more than exotic goods and weary travellers. You watch from the monastery walls as merchants unload their cargo, unaware that they are also releasing an invisible enemy that will reshape the very foundations of monastic life. The Black Death has arrived, and you're about to witness how a microscopic bacterium can accomplish what centuries of warfare and political upheaval could not: the systematic emptying of Europe's most stable institutions. You observe the plague's inexorable march across the continent like a dark tide washing over everything in its path. Within months, the disease spreads from trading posts to villages, from villages to towns, and inevitably to the monastery gates where you stand. The irony strikes you immediately. These holy communities, dedicated to serving the sick and poor, become some of the most vulnerable targets for the very suffering they have sworn to alleviate. Inside the monastery walls, you witness the initial response with a mixture of admiration and foreboding. The monks don't flee or bar their gates against the afflicted. Instead, they open their doors wider, transforming the infirmary from a modest facility into a makeshift hospital, overflowing with plague victims. You watch as Brother Thomas, the monastery's physician, works tirelessly among rows of fevered patients, his face pale with exhaustion, but his dedication unwavering. The monastery's reputation for healing draws desperate families from miles around, each carrying their loved ones to what they hope will be sanctuary, but what becomes, tragically, a concentration point for contagion. The plague's assault on monastic communities proves devastating beyond anything you could imagine. You observe how quickly the disease spreads through dormitories where monks sleep side by side, through refectories where they share meals, and through chapels where they gather for prayer. The very communal nature that makes monastic life spiritually powerful becomes epidemiologically catastrophic. When one monk falls ill, you watch the infection ripple through the community like fire through dry timber. You witness scenes that would break the strongest hearts. In the scriptorium, Brother Benedict collapses over a half-finished illumination, his paintbrush still wet with gold leaf. The monastery's treasurer dies while counting coins donated for plague relief, his final act one of service. Most heartbreaking of all, you see young novices who entered the monastery seeking spiritual enlightenment, instead finding only suffering and death. Some monasteries lose their entire communities within weeks, leaving only empty buildings and unfinished prayers. The mathematical brutality of the plague's impact becomes clear as you examine monastery records. Before 1347, this abbey housed 150 monks, 50 lay brothers, and numerous servants and workers, a thriving community of over 250 souls. By 1350, barely 30 survivors remain, and most of those are too sick or traumatized to maintain normal operations. You calculate that the monastery has lost nearly 90% of its population, a mortality rate that would challenge even modern institutions, let alone medieval ones dependent on manual labour and personal relationships. You observe how the plague disrupts every aspect of monastic life with ruthless efficiency. The carefully maintained agricultural operations collapse as farmers die or flee. Fields of grain stand unharvested while livestock wander untended. The monastery's famous scriptorium falls silent as the scribes who preserved humanity's knowledge succumb one by one. Even more tragically, you watch as the spiritual life of the community fragmenting. There aren't enough healthy monks left to maintain the full cycle of daily prayers, and the survivors struggle with profound theological questions about why God would allow such suffering to befall his most devoted servants. The economic consequences prove as devastating as the human toll. You examine the monastery's financial records and see how quickly prosperity turns to poverty. Rental income disappears as tenant farmers die or abandon their holdings. Donations dry up as potential benefactors either perish or face their own economic crises. The monastery's crafts workshops stand idle, their master artisans buried in hastily dug graves behind the chapel. What took centuries to build crumbles in months. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was primarily a natural catastrophe or whether social and environmental factors made European society particularly vulnerable. You sense the truth probably lies somewhere between divine judgment and human folly. The medieval practice of living in crowded, unsanitary conditions certainly accelerated the plague's spread. While the era's limited medical knowledge left communities defenseless against bacterial warfare they couldn't even comprehend, you witness a particularly tragic irony as the monastery's charitable mission becomes its downfall. The monks who survive the initial wave of infection face an impossible moral choice. continue serving plague victims and risk the community's complete extinction, or close their doors and abandon their sacred mission to serve the sick. Most choose continued service, and you watch with mixed admiration and sorrow as communities deliberately march toward martyrdom rather than abandon their calling. The psychological impact on survivors proves as destructive as the physical disease. You observe Brother Francis, one of the few remaining monks, wandering the empty cloisters like a ghost among memories. He speaks to absent friends, sets places at table for the dead, and maintains routines designed for communities of hundreds with only a handful of participants. The survivors suffer from what we might recognize today as severe trauma. Though medieval minds interpret their symptoms as spiritual trials or divine punishment, you notice how quickly wild animals reclaim abandoned monastery grounds. Deer graze in courtyards where monks once processed a prayer. Birds nest in the scriptorium's broken windows. Vines creep over carefully tended gardens, and wells fill with leaves and debris. Nature doesn't mourn human absence. It simply flows back into spaces temporarily claimed by civilization. The sight reminds you that even humanity's most permanent-seeming institutions are just temporary arrangements in the larger flow of time. Some monasteries attempt desperate measures to survive. You watch as Brother Augustine, now serving as acting abbot of a community reduced to 12 members, tries to recruit new monks from the surrounding countryside. But the plague has created a crisis of faith among potential candidates. Young men who might once have felt called to monastic life now question whether religious communities offer protection or simply provide more efficient ways to meet death. The practical challenges of maintaining monastery operations with skeleton crews prove insurmountable. You observe how quickly centuries-old traditions disappear when there aren't enough people to practice them. The elaborate daily prayer cycle simplifies by necessity. Complex administrative systems collapse into basic survival management. The monastery's famous hospitality becomes impossible to maintain when there aren't enough hands to prepare meals or beds for guests. As you survey the devastation left in the plague's wake, you understand that this catastrophe marks a fundamental turning point in European monasticism. Even communities that survive will never fully recover their pre-plague vitality. The Black Death hasn't just killed individual monks, it has shattered the confident assumption that monastic communities represent permanent fixtures in the medieval landscape. The plague has proven that even the most sacred institutions remain vulnerable to forces beyond human control, and this knowledge will haunt monastic communities for generations to come. You sense that the empty halls and silent chapels around you represent more than temporary setbacks. They are harbingers of a new era when monasticism must compete with secular institutions for resources, respect, and relevance in a world that has learned not to take permanence for granted. Do you remember watching the monastery's treasury overflowing with golden chalices and silver coins just decades earlier? Now you stand in that same counting room as Brother Marcus, the monastery's treasurer, stares at ledger books filled with increasingly grim numbers. The post-plague world has fundamentally altered the economic landscape that once made monasteries the wealthiest institutions in medieval Europe. And you're about to witness how financial pressures can empty holy halls as effectively as any disease. You observe the stark transformation in the monastery's revenue stream since the Black Death's devastation. The carefully maintained agricultural estates that once provided reliable income now struggle with chronic labour shortages. You walk through fields where weeds grow among unharvested crops, past villages where half the houses stand empty with their roofs caving in. The survivors demand higher wages for their labour, a revolutionary concept that challenges centuries of feudal tradition. Where peasants once worked monastery lands for subsistence and protection, they now negotiate for actual coins, driving up the monastery's operating costs exponentially. The mathematics of monastic decline become painfully clear as you examine the account book. before the plague. Rental income from monastery lands generated enough revenue to support 200 monks, maintain extensive charitable operations, and fund ambitious building projects. Now, with rental income reduced by 60% and wage costs tripled, the same lands can barely sustain 40 monks living at subsistence level. You watch Brother Marcus calculate and recalculate the numbers, searching for mathematical miracles that simply don't exist. You witness the monastery's desperate attempts to adapt to new economic realities. The surviving monks try to work the fields themselves, but years devoted to prayer and scholarship haven't prepared them for the back-breaking labour of agriculture. You observe Brother Benedict, a renowned theologian, struggling to guide a plough while his soft hands blister and bleed. The sight would be comical if it weren't so tragic. These men have devoted their lives to spiritual and intellectual pursuits, only to discover that survival requires skills they never learned. The monastery's traditional sources of donation face their own crises. You notice how dramatically the character of gifts has changed. Before the plague, wealthy nobles competed to donate entire villages or vast estates to monasteries, seeking spiritual insurance policies for their souls. Now, survivors focus on rebuilding their own devastated holdings rather than supporting religious institutions. The donations that do arrive consist mostly of small coins from desperate peasants seeking prayers for dead relatives. Touching gestures that generate barely enough income to buy bread. You observe a particularly heartbreaking example of economic pressure when Lady Eleanor, a long-time monastery patron, visits the abbot with tears in her eyes. Her family has supported this monastery for 5 generations, but the plague killed 3 of her sons and destroyed most of her tenant farms. She explains that she must choose between continuing her charitable donations and feeding her surviving children. The abbot absolves her of any obligation, but you sense his quiet desperation as another crucial income source disappears. The monastery's famous scriptorium faces especially severe challenges. You watch as Brother William carefully rations precious parchment and ink, materials that once flowed freely but now cost small fortunes. The market for illuminated manuscripts has collapsed as potential buyers either died in the plague or faced their own financial crises. A book that once sold for enough gold to feed the monastery for months now finds no buyers at any price. The irony strikes you deeply, in an age when knowledge has become more precious than ever. The institutions dedicated to preserving it can no longer afford the materials to do so. You witness the monastery's painful decisions about which buildings and operations to maintain. The guest house, once a point of pride that accommodated travellers from across Europe, closes its doors because there aren't enough resources to provide proper hospitality. Sections of the monastery itself are sealed off to conserve heating fuel during winter months. You observe monks moving their few remaining possessions into a handful of rooms, abandoning vast halls that echo with memories of busier times. The practical challenges of maintenance compound the financial pressures. You watch as the monastery's roof develops leaks that can't be repaired because hiring skilled craftsmen costs more than the community can afford. The famous library, once climate controlled by an ingenious system of air vents and heating ducts, now suffers from moisture damage that threatens centuries of accumulated knowledge. Books that survived Viking raids and political upheavals face destruction from simple neglect and insufficient funds for preservation. Historians still argue whether the economic crisis following the Black Death represented a temporary adjustment or a fundamental shift in European society. You sense the truth encompasses both perspectives. The immediate crisis was indeed temporary, but it accelerated longer-term changes in labour relations, monetary systems, and social structures that would have occurred eventually. The plague simply compressed decades of gradual economic evolution into a few catastrophic years. You observe how the monastery attempts various entrepreneurial ventures to generate income. The monks try brewing ale for commercial sale. but lack the expertise to compete with established brewers. They attempt to rent out monastery buildings for secular purposes. But potential tenants worry about the spiritual complications of conducting business in consecrated spaces. Most tragically, you watch as the monastery begins selling its treasured books and religious artifacts, liquidating centuries of accumulated cultural wealth for short-term survival. The credit relationships that once sustained monastery operations crumble under economic pressure. You notice how Italian banking houses, once eager to loan money against monastery lands and anticipated donations, now demand immediate repayment of existing debts. The monastery's credit rating, if such modern concepts existed, has plummeted from blue-chip security to junk status. Brother Marcus explains to confused monks how institutions that once begged for the privilege of managing monastery finances now refuse even basic banking services. The social implications of monastic economic decline ripple throughout surrounding communities. You observe how villages that depended on monastery employment and charity face their own crises as their primary economic anchor weakens. The monastery's traditional role as a social safety net becomes impossible to maintain when the institution itself needs assistance. Former monastery workers join the ranks of wandering poor, seeking employment in a labour market already saturated with plague survivors. You witness a particularly poignant scene as the monastery's bells, cast from bronze donated by generations of faithful patrons, are removed and sold to pay pressing debts. The sound of those bells had marked time for the surrounding countryside for over 400 years, calling workers to their fields and families to their prayers. The silence speaks more eloquently than words about the depth of the monastery's crisis. The psychological impact on the remaining monks proves as devastating as the financial pressure. You observe Brother Thomas, once confident in divine providence, struggling with doubts about whether God has abandoned their community. The prosperity that monks had interpreted as divine blessing has vanished, replaced by poverty that challenges their fundamental understanding of their relationship with heaven. Some wonder whether their suffering represents punishment for some unknown transgression, while others question whether worldly success ever had spiritual significance. As you survey the monastery's reduced circumstances, you understand that economic pressure is systematically dismantling an institution that survived centuries of political upheaval, foreign invasion, and natural disaster. The irony cuts deeply. An institution founded on principles of poverty and spiritual detachment faces extinction because it can no longer afford to maintain its mission of service to others. The economic forces reshaping post-plague Europe have turned the monastery's greatest strength, its integration into medieval society, into a fatal vulnerability. Do you remember the monastery's golden age when abbots were chosen through careful spiritual discernment by their monastic communities? Now you witness a very different scene as King Edward's messenger rides through the monastery gates, bearing a royal decree that will install the king's own cousin as the new abbot. The parchment crackles in the morning air as Brother Francis reads the appointment aloud, his voice trembling not from age but from the realization that their community's ancient right of self-governance has just evaporated like morning mist. You observe the systematic transformation of monastic independence into royal chess pieces as medieval monarchs discover that controlling religious institutions provides both spiritual legitimacy and practical wealth. The monastery you're watching has become a prize in political games played in distant courts, where kings and nobles treat abbacies like family businesses to be distributed among relatives and political allies. The spiritual qualifications that once determined monastic leadership now matter less than blood, relationships, and court connections. You witness the arrival of the new royal appointee, a man whose ecclesiastical experience consists primarily of owning several hunting dogs and a reputation for excellent wine selection. Abbot Geoffrey, for that's what he insists on being called despite never taking proper monastic vows, sweeps into the monastery with an entourage of servants, mistresses, and hunting companions that transforms the quiet cloisters into something resembling a medieval nightclub. You watch in fascination and horror as he orders the monastery's chapel bells melted down to fund a new banquet hall, explaining that God surely prefers a happy congregation to a musical one. The practical consequences of royal interference ripple through every aspect of monastic life. You observe how quickly centuries-old traditions crumble when leadership lacks understanding of or commitment to monastic principles. The carefully maintained balance between prayer, work, and study collapses as the new abbot focuses exclusively on generating revenue to fund his lavish lifestyle. Morning prayers become optional suggestions rather than sacred obligations, and you notice how many monks simply stop attending when their leader treats spiritual exercises as inconvenient interruptions to more important business. You witness the monastery's transformation into what essentially amounts to a royal subsidiary corporation. King Edward uses the abbey's lands as rewards for political supporters, granting lifetime tenancies to nobles who helped fund his latest military campaigns. The monastery's traditional agricultural operations become secondary to the new tenants' hunting preserves and ornamental gardens. You watch as Brother Augustine, who spent decades perfecting the monastery's crop rotation systems, stands helplessly while courtiers convert productive farmland into decorative mazes designed to entertain visiting dignitaries. The appointment of unqualified abbots creates cascading administrative disasters that you witness with growing amazement. Abbot Geoffrey attempts to run the monastery using management techniques learned from overseeing his family's trading enterprises, with predictably catastrophic results. He institutes a complex system of productivity bonuses for monks, offering extra wine rations for completing assigned prayers ahead of schedule. You observe the theological chaos that ensues when Brother Thomas finishes his morning devotions in record time by simply mumbling Latin words randomly, then claims his bonus vintage with a straight face. You notice how royal interference attracts the attention of neighbouring nobles who want their own piece of monastic wealth. Duke Robert begins pressuring the monastery to lease him fishing rights to the abbey's river, while Count William demands access to the monastery's famous quarry for his castle construction project. The monastery, once protected by its spiritual purpose and royal charters, becomes fair game for secular exploitation when the crown itself demonstrates that religious institutions are just another form of property to be managed for profit. The corruption spreads through the monastic community like ink through water. You observe younger monks adapting to the new reality by abandoning their spiritual pursuits in favour of cultivating political connections. Brother Michael, once devoted to manuscript illumination, now spends his time composing flattering poetry about royal family members, hoping to secure a lucrative appointment to a wealthier abbey. The monastery's famous library becomes a networking centre where monks trade gossip about court intrigues rather than engaging in scholarly research. Historians still argue whether royal interference represented a natural evolution of church-state relations or a fundamental corruption of monastic ideals. You sense the truth lies in understanding how desperate circumstances create opportunities for exploitation. Monasteries weakened by plague and economic pressure become vulnerable to political predators who recognize that religious institutions stripped of their independence lose much of their reason for existence. You witness particularly egregious examples of political manipulation during abbatial elections. When the monastery attempts to choose Brother Benedict, a respected scholar and administrator, as their new leader, they discover that King Edward has already promised the position to his illegitimate son as part of a complex diplomatic arrangement with French nobles. The monk's carefully reasoned selection process becomes meaningless theatre when royal messengers arrive with pre-written appointment documents. You watch Brother Benedict's face as he realizes that his decades of faithful service count for nothing against bloodline politics. The monastery's financial independence disappears as royal appointees treat abbey treasuries like personal bank accounts. You observe Abbot Geoffrey borrowing monastery funds to finance his gambling debts, with vague promises of eventual repayment that everyone knows will never materialize. The monastery's carefully accumulated wealth, built through centuries of donations and prudent management, evaporates to fund court entertainments and political bribes that have nothing to do with religious purposes. You notice how royal interference creates conflicts between monastic communities and their traditional supporters. Local nobles who donated lands and wealth to the monastery expecting spiritual returns find themselves dealing with court appointees who treat their ancestral gifts as personal property. Lady Margaret, whose family endowed the monastery's chapel, discovers that the new abbot has sold her family's burial rights to raise funds for a royal hunting lodge. The resulting legal battles consume resources and energy that monasteries can ill afford to waste. The psychological impact on committed monks proves devastating. You observe Brother Francis, who entered the monastery seeking spiritual guidance and community fellowship, struggling with profound disillusionment as his institution becomes indistinguishable from any secular business enterprise. The gap between monastic ideals and daily reality grows so wide that maintaining faith requires either willful blindness or extraordinary mental compartmentalization. You witness the development of parallel power structures within the monastery as committed monks attempt to preserve authentic religious life despite corrupt leadership. Brother Thomas organizes informal prayer groups that meet secretly to maintain traditional spiritual practices. These underground religious activities within supposedly religious institutions create surreal situations where monks must hide their authentic devotion from their official leaders. The monastery's reputation in surrounding communities suffers irreparable damage. You observe how villagers who once viewed the abbey as a source of moral guidance and practical assistance now treat it with suspicion and resentment. The monastery's traditional role as a neutral mediator in local disputes becomes impossible when everyone knows the abbot's primary loyalty lies with distant political masters rather than community welfare. As you survey the transformation of this once proud religious institution into a royal subsidiary, you understand that political interference has accomplished something even plague and poverty couldn't achieve: the complete corruption of the monastery's spiritual mission. The building remains, the monks continue their routines, but the essential purpose that justified the institution's existence has been systematically destroyed by treating sacred communities as secular political resources. You sense that this corruption represents more than administrative mismanagement. It signals a fundamental shift in how European society views the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority, with monasteries becoming the first casualties in a larger struggle that will eventually reshape the entire medieval world. Do you remember the monastery's reputation for spiritual purity and moral guidance that once drew pilgrims from across Europe? Now you peer through the scriptorium windows at dawn and witness Brother Aldrich stumbling back from the village tavern, his monk's robes stained with wine and his arm draped around a giggling serving wench named Margot. The transformation you're observing isn't subtle. It's a spectacular collapse of monastic discipline that would make even the most tolerant medieval bishops reach for their excommunication papers. You watch in fascination as the monastery's moral authority crumbles from within, victim to the very human appetites that monastic vows were designed to control. The crisis of leadership following royal interference has created a vacuum where traditional discipline once maintained order, and nature, along with human nature, abhors a vacuum. What flows in to fill that space isn't spiritual enlightenment, but a carnival of earthly pleasures that transforms the holy community into something resembling a medieval fraternity house. You observe the systematic breakdown of the three fundamental monastic vows that once defined religious life: The vow of poverty becomes a joke when you witness Brother Marcus maintaining a private wine cellar, stocked with vintages that cost more than most peasants earn in a decade. He justifies his collection as sacramental research, though you notice his theological investigations seem to require substantial daily sampling. The irony strikes you as delicious. Monks who once shared a single cup of watered wine now compete to acquire the most expensive bottles available from travelling merchants. The vow of chastity faces even more creative interpretation. You discover that Brother Jerome has established what he calls a spiritual counselling service for local widows, though the sessions always seem to require closed doors and generate surprising amounts of feminine giggling. The monastery's guest quarters, once reserved for pilgrims and travellers, now accommodate a steady stream of spiritual seekers who happen to be young, attractive, and remarkably flexible in their theological discussions. You witness the monastery's transformation into a medieval entertainment complex that would make Hugh Hefner proud. Brother Thomas organises what he calls religious festivals that feature dancing, drinking, and activities that stretch the definition of worship beyond any recognisable meaning. The monastery's chapel hosts these events where Gregorian chant gives way to tavern songs, and communion wine flows more freely than water. Local villagers initially attend out of curiosity, but soon return regularly for entertainment that combines the excitement of sin with the convenience of absolution. The corruption spreads through the community with remarkable creativity and thoroughness. You observe Brother William establishing a gambling operation in the monastery's crypt, reasoning that games of chance help teach theological lessons about divine providence and human fate. The deceased abbots buried below probably spin in their stone sarcophagi as dice roll across their tomb slabs, but Brother William insists they're contributing to ongoing religious education in the afterlife. You watch as the monastery's famous scriptorium transforms from a centre of learning into a medieval publishing house for questionable literature. Brother Benedict, once renowned for his illuminated psalters, now specialises in illustrated manuscripts that would be banned in most respectable libraries. His artistic skills remain impressive, but the subject matter has shifted dramatically from saints' lives to considerably more anatomical studies. The monastery's reputation for scholarly excellence takes on entirely new meanings as word spreads through Europe's underground literary networks. The monastery's economic functions adapt to serve these new priorities with entrepreneurial enthusiasm. You notice how quickly the brothers discover that certain services generate far more income than traditional religious offerings. The monastery's brewing operation, once producing simple ales for community consumption, now creates specialised beverages with names like Friar's Folly and Sinner's Salvation that command premium prices in local taverns. The monks' newfound business acumen would be admirable if it weren't so thoroughly corrupting their spiritual mission. Historians still argue whether widespread monastic corruption represented moral failure or rational adaptation to changing social conditions. You sense the truth encompasses both perspectives. Monks faced with collapsing institutions and absent leadership naturally sought alternative sources of meaning and income, though their chosen alternatives often contradicted everything monasticism claimed to represent. You observe the psychological transformation of individual monks as they abandoned spiritual disciplines for worldly pleasures. Brother Francis, once dedicated to contemplative prayer and fasting, discovers that regular meals and comfortable sleeping arrangements significantly improve his mood and productivity. His theological justifications for abandoning ascetic practices become increasingly sophisticated as his lifestyle becomes increasingly comfortable. He develops elaborate theories about how suffering actually distances souls from divine love, requiring monks to embrace earthly joys as religious obligations. The monastery's relationship with surrounding communities undergoes dramatic revision. You watch as local nobles who once treated the abbey with reverent respect now view it as a convenient entertainment venue for their own questionable activities. Duke Robert hosts hunting parties at the monastery that conclude with celebrations that would scandalise Proper's courtly society. The monastery provides perfect cover for activities that would generate gossip if conducted in secular settings. After all, who would suspect improper behaviour in a house of God? You witness the development of a sophisticated economy of corruption where everyone profits, except the monastery's original spiritual mission. Local merchants discover that monks with guilty consciences make excellent customers for luxury goods they can rationalise as religious necessities. Village women find employment opportunities providing various services to spiritually needy brothers. Even the local bishop benefits by collecting substantial penance fees from monks seeking absolution for their creative interpretations of religious vows. The monastery's traditional charitable works continue, but with modified purposes and methods. You observe the infirmary treating ailments that seem suspiciously related to the brothers' recreational activities. The guest house provides accommodations for visitors whose spiritual needs apparently require extensive physical comfort. The monastery's famous hospitality takes on new dimensions as the brothers discover that generous entertainment generates both repeat customers and substantial donations. You notice how corruption becomes self-perpetuating as the monastery attracts new members drawn by its relaxed standards rather than its spiritual mission. Young men seeking easy livings rather than religious callings discover that monastic vows provide excellent cover for lifestyles that would be scandalous in secular society. The recruitment process gradually filters out genuinely devout candidates in favour of those who appreciate the monastery's evolved interpretation of religious life. The theological creativity required to justify these behaviours produces some remarkable intellectual gymnastics. You listen as Brother Augustine explains how his extensive research into local taverns represents legitimate anthropological study of popular religious practices. Brother Michael develops complex theories about how earthly pleasures prepare souls for heavenly rewards by providing necessary comparative experiences. The monastery's library fills with theological treatises that would make professional philosophers weep with either admiration or despair. As you survey the monastery's comprehensive moral collapse, you understand that corruption has accomplished something external pressures never could: the complete hollowing out of institutional purpose. The buildings remain standing, the routines continue, but the spiritual core that justified the monastery's existence has been systematically replaced by material concerns dressed in religious language. You sense that this corruption represents more than individual moral failure. It reflects the broader crisis of medieval religious institutions caught between idealistic missions and practical realities. When external support systems collapse and internal discipline fails, human nature reasserts itself with remarkable consistency and creativity. The monastery's descent into entertaining decadence may be spiritually tragic, but it's also perfectly predictable given the circumstances surrounding it. Do you remember Brother Aldrich stumbling back from the village tavern just a few years ago? Now you witness a far more dramatic scene as King Henry VIII's commissioners ride through these same monastery gates, their leather saddlebags bulging with official seals and their eyes calculating the value of every stone, chalice and acre of land they survey. The year is 1536, and you're about to observe the most systematic destruction of monastic life in European history. A royal demolition project that will empty more monasteries in a decade than plague. Poverty and corruption combined managed in centuries. You watch as Thomas Cromwell's agents methodically catalogue the monastery's assets with the efficiency of professional liquidators. They move through the buildings like locusts in expensive clothing, measuring tapestries, weighing silver candlesticks, and estimating the market value of illuminated manuscripts that took monks lifetimes to create. The lead commissioner, a sharp-faced man named Richard Leighton, treats the sacred chalices like any other commodity inventory. making notes about gold purity and resale potential with the detached professionalism of a medieval pawnbroker. The legal justification for this wholesale seizure reveals the remarkable creativity of Tudor bureaucracy. You observe how Henry's lawyers have constructed an elaborate framework that transforms religious theft into patriotic duty. The Act of Supremacy declares the king supreme head of the English Church, making him technically the monastery's landlord with authority to evict tenants who fail to acknowledge his spiritual authority. You marvel at the legal gymnastics that turn monastic property into crown assets through the simple expedient of redefining who owns God's earthly representatives. You witness the monks' bewildered response to this bureaucratic blitzkrieg. Abbot Benedict, a man who has spent 40 years managing the monastery's spiritual and temporal affairs, finds himself reduced to a confused bystander as royal commissioners inventory his life's work. He attempts to negotiate, pointing out the monastery's centuries of loyal service to English kings. But Commissioner Leighton explains with polite ruthlessness that past loyalty counts for nothing when present obedience is in question. The abbot's choice is stark: surrender the monastery peacefully and receive a modest pension, or resist and face charges of treason that carry significantly less comfortable retirement options. The speed of the dissolution process demonstrates remarkable administrative efficiency. You observe how Henry's government has transformed monastery closure into an assembly line operation that would impress modern corporate raiders. Teams of valuers, accountants, and legal clerks move through religious communities with practiced precision, completing asset seizures that reduce centuries-old institutions to paperwork in a matter of days. The monastery you're watching, which took 200 years to build and 400 years to perfect, disappears as a functioning institution in less than a week. You watch the systematic dismantling of monastic infrastructure with fascination and horror. The commissioners don't just seize liquid assets, they orchestrate the physical destruction of buildings that can't be easily converted to secular use. You observe workers using sledgehammers to destroy the monastery's magnificent church, not from religious hatred but from practical economics. The lead roof provides valuable material for royal building projects. While the stone can be recycled for crown construction needs, the destruction is methodical rather than passionate, making it somehow more chilling than violence motivated by theological fury. The human cost of dissolution becomes apparent as you witness the monks' desperate attempts to preserve their community's legacy. Brother Thomas secretly copies important manuscripts, hiding them in hollowed-out tree trunks and false walls, hoping future generations might recover the monastery's intellectual treasures. Brother William distributes the monastery's medical supplies to local villages, reasoning that healing knowledge shouldn't perish with the institution that preserved it. These small acts of preservation represent touching but ultimately futile gestures against the overwhelming machinery of state-sponsored liquidation. Historians still argue whether Henry's dissolution represented religious reform or economic opportunism disguised as theology. You sense the truth involves both motivations operating simultaneously. Henry genuinely wanted to establish royal supremacy over English religion, while also desperately needing monastery wealth to fund his expensive military campaigns and lavish court lifestyle. The theological justifications provide convenient cover for what amounts to the largest property seizure in English history. You observe the broader social consequences as dissolution ripples through communities that depended on monastic services. The monastery school closes, leaving local children without educational opportunities that existed nowhere else in the region. The infirmary shuts down, creating a healthcare crisis for villages that relied on monastic medical knowledge. The guest house stops accommodating travellers, forcing pilgrims and merchants to find alternative lodging in communities unprepared to provide hospitality services. The economic impact proves devastating for entire regions. You watch as the monastery's complex network of tenants, suppliers, and employees faces sudden unemployment. The abbey's brewers, bakers, craftsmen, and agricultural workers discover that their specialised skills have limited value outside the monastic economy. Many join the growing ranks of displaced poor who wander English roads seeking work in a labour market already saturated with dissolution refugees. You witness the psychological trauma experienced by monks whose entire identity was built around institutional membership. Brother Augustine, who entered the monastery as a teenager and spent 30 years rising through its hierarchy, finds himself at age 50 with no marketable skills beyond Latin translation and theological disputation. The pension he receives, when he actually receives it, provides bare subsistence but no sense of purpose or community belonging. Some former monks attempt to establish new religious communities, but royal authorities monitor such activities carefully to prevent underground monasticism from taking root. The theological implications of dissolution create profound spiritual crises for both monks and their former supporters. You observe how quickly centuries of religious certainty crumble when state power declares that institutions blessed by countless generations of faithful believers were actually obstacles to divine will. Local nobles who donated land and wealth to monasteries suddenly discover that their pious gifts have become treasonous associations, requiring careful disavowal to avoid political suspicion. You watch as monastery buildings undergo rapid transformation into secular purposes that would have horrified their original builders. The monastery's chapel becomes a private residence for Thomas Cromwell's nephew, who installs large windows and decorative gardens where altars once stood. The cloisters convert to livestock pens, while the scriptorium serves as a grain storage facility. The sacred spaces that once resonated with centuries of prayer now echo with purely material concerns. The international implications of Henry's dissolution extend far beyond English borders. You observe how European monasteries watch the English example with growing alarm, recognizing that royal supremacy over religious institutions could easily spread to other kingdoms facing similar financial pressures. The dissolution demonstrates that even the most established religious communities remain vulnerable to political power when spiritual authority conflicts with royal authority. The efficiency of Henry's dissolution becomes a template for later secularization efforts across Europe. You witness the development of administrative techniques for evaluating religious property, managing displaced clergy, and converting sacred buildings to secular use that will be employed by revolutionary governments for centuries. The English dissolution proves that systematic destruction of religious institutions can be accomplished through bureaucratic rather than military means, making it both more thorough and more difficult to resist. As you survey the empty buildings and scattered communities left in dissolution's wake, you understand that Henry VIII has accomplished something previous challenges never achieved: the complete elimination of English monasticism as an independent force in society, where plague, corruption, and economic pressure weakened monastic communities. Royal dissolution has simply erased them entirely, proving that political power ultimately trumps all other considerations when survival is at stake. Do you remember Henry VIII's systematic dismantling of English monasteries through royal decree? Now you witness an even more far-reaching transformation as Protestant ideas sweep across the European continent like wildfire through dry timber. The year is 1517, and you stand in the German town of Wittenberg watching a young monk named Martin Luther nail a document to the castle church door. 95 propositions that will ultimately empty more monasteries than all the plagues, famines, and royal seizures combined. You observe how Luther's theological revolution strikes at the very heart of monastic existence with surgical precision. His doctrine of salvation by faith alone renders the entire monastic system spiritually obsolete overnight. You watch as monks across Germany read Luther's writings and experience profound theological vertigo. If salvation comes through divine grace rather than good works, then What purpose do monasteries serve? The elaborate system of prayers, fasting, and charitable acts that justified monastic life becomes not just unnecessary but potentially blasphemous, representing human attempts to earn divine favour that God offers freely. The psychological impact on individual monks proves devastating as their life's work loses all theological meaning. You witness Brother Johann in a Saxon monastery staring at his prayer book with dawning horror, realising that every hour spent in devotional exercises might actually represent prideful self-righteousness rather than humble service to God. The certainty that once sustained monastic communities through centuries of hardship evaporates in the face of Protestant theology that declares their fundamental mission a dangerous delusion. You watch as entire monastic communities dissolve through voluntary abandonment as monks embrace Protestant teachings. Unlike Henry VIII's forced dissolutions, these departures result from genuine conversion experiences that leave former monks convinced they're escaping spiritual bondage rather than abandoning sacred callings. Brother Wilhelm, a Franciscan friar, publicly burns his monastic robes in the town square while preaching about his liberation from papist superstitions. The symbolism strikes you as profound. Men who once considered their religious habits sacred vestments now treat them as symbols of theological error. The speed with which Protestant ideas penetrate monastic communities reveals the extent of existing spiritual dissatisfaction. You observe how quickly monks who seem content with traditional religious life embrace radical alternatives when presented with intellectual justifications for abandoning their vows. The Protestant critique of monastic celibacy proves particularly persuasive. Luther's own marriage to a former nun creates a powerful example that validates monks' suppressed desires for family life and sexual expression. You witness the emergence of Protestant alternative communities that attempt to preserve monastic ideals while abandoning Catholic structures. Some former monks establish communal settlements based on biblical principles rather than traditional monastic rules. These experiments in Protestant monasticism typically fail within a few years, but they demonstrate genuine attempts to maintain spiritual community while rejecting papal authority. The contradiction proves impossible to resolve. Protestant emphasis on individual conscience conflicts fundamentally with the communal discipline that makes monastic life functional. The economic implications of Protestant conversion extend far beyond individual spiritual decisions. You observe how monasteries that embrace Protestant teachings face immediate financial crises as traditional sources of support disappear. Catholic donors stop contributing to institutions they now consider heretical, while Protestant supporters question whether religious communities should accumulate worldly wealth at all. The monasteries find themselves caught between theological systems that offer no viable economic foundation for continued existence. Historians still argue whether the Protestant Reformation represented authentic spiritual renewal or disguised political rebellion against papal authority. You sense the truth encompasses both motivations operating simultaneously, genuine theological convictions combined with political and economic interests that benefited from challenging church power. The monastery closures that result from Protestant conversion serve multiple masters, satisfying both spiritual reformers and secular authorities eager to claim ecclesiastical wealth. You watch as Protestant princes use religious reform to justify seizing monastic property with the same enthusiasm Henry VIII displayed in England. Duke Frederick of Saxony closes monasteries in his territory not through violent suppression but through patient persuasion that convinces monks their institutions represent obstacles to true Christianity. The seizure of monastery wealth becomes a pious act rather than political opportunism, though you notice the practical results remain identical regardless of motivation. The theological creativity of Protestant reformers in dismantling monastic arguments proves remarkably sophisticated. You observe John Calvin developing elaborate biblical exegeses that demonstrate why monastic vows contradict Christian freedom and why communal property violates divine intentions for individual stewardship. These arguments don't simply attack monasticism, they construct complete alternative theological frameworks that make traditional monastic life appear not just wrong, but spiritually dangerous. You witness the tragic personal conflicts experienced by monks torn between traditional loyalties and Protestant convictions. Brother Andreas spends months in agonized prayer, seeking divine guidance about whether his monastic vows represent sacred commitments or sinful presumption. His eventual decision to leave the monastery and marry destroys relationships with former brothers who consider him an apostate. While Protestant communities remain suspicious of his Catholic background, the theological revolution creates casualties among precisely the people most committed to religious life. The Protestant critique of monastic education proves particularly devastating to institutions that prided themselves on scholarly achievement. You observe how reformers argue that monastery schools teach papal superstitions rather than biblical truth, making their intellectual accomplishments worthless or actively harmful. The famous monastery libraries that preserved classical knowledge through centuries of barbarian invasions suddenly become repositories of theological error, requiring careful purification or outright destruction. You watch as former monastery buildings undergo conversion to Protestant purposes that consciously reject their Catholic heritage. The elaborate chapels designed for complex liturgical ceremonies become simple meeting halls where congregants sit on plain benches to hear scripture readings and sermons. The artistic treasures that once inspired contemplative prayer are removed or destroyed as distractions from pure biblical worship. The architectural transformation reflects deeper theological changes that strip away centuries of accumulated religious tradition. The international implications of Protestant monastery closures create cascading effects across European religious and political systems. You observe how Catholic authorities respond with increasingly aggressive measures to prevent further defections, including military intervention in territories where Protestant ideas threaten ecclesiastical property rights. The monastery closures become symbols in larger conflicts between competing versions of Christianity that will devastate Europe for generations. You notice how Protestant emphasis on married clergy fundamentally undermines the social foundations of monastic communities. When religious leadership embraces family life and sexual expression as positive goods, rather than spiritual obstacles, the ascetic ideals that justified monastic existence lose their theological foundation. The celibate monk transforms from a spiritual athlete reaching for divine perfection into a misguided individual, avoiding God-given responsibilities for marriage and procreation. The Protestant doctrine of the priesthood of all believers eliminates the special spiritual status that made monastic life attractive to medieval Christians seeking closer relationships with God. You watch as reformers argue that ordinary believers working secular jobs can achieve the same spiritual heights as cloistered monks through faith alone. This democratization of spiritual possibility makes monastic withdrawal seem not just unnecessary, but potentially selfish, an escape from Christian obligations to serve God through worldly vocations. As you survey the empty monasteries and scattered communities across Protestant Europe, you understand that the Reformation has accomplished something previous challenges never achieved: the complete intellectual discrediting of monastic ideals among significant populations. Where external pressures weakened monasteries while leaving their spiritual reputation intact, Protestant theology attacks the very concepts that made monastic life seem desirable, ensuring that even successful monastery reforms couldn't restore their fundamental appeal to Christian populations, convinced that salvation comes through faith rather than works. Do you remember watching Protestant theology systematically dismantling the intellectual foundations of monastic life? Now you observe a far more visceral and immediate threat as the thunder of cannons echoes across monastery walls, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mingles with incense in desecrated chapels. The endless wars that plague medieval and early modern Europe transform peaceful religious communities into strategic targets, refugee camps, and casualties of conflicts that have nothing to do with monastic spirituality, but everything to do with the monastery's unfortunate location between armies that view neutrality as a luxury they can't afford. You witness the monastery's naive attempts to maintain its traditional neutrality as competing armies approach from opposite directions. Abbot Benedict flies both the Imperial Eagle and the French fleur-de-lis from the monastery towers, hoping to signal peaceful intentions to whichever force arrives first. His diplomatic strategy reflects centuries of successful monastic navigation through political storms, but you sense that the escalating scale and intensity of European warfare has fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. Modern armies can't afford to respect sanctuaries when military necessity demands strategic positions. The arrival of imperial troops demonstrates how quickly monastic hospitality transforms from religious obligation into military requisition. You observe Captain Heinrich von Stauffen explaining to the increasingly pale abbot that his cavalry regiment requires temporary accommodation for 200 soldiers, along with stabling for their horses, food for their men, and strategic positioning for their artillery. The captain's polite language barely conceals the reality that the monastery has just been militarized whether the monks consent or not. The ancient rite of sanctuary becomes meaningless when armies bring their conflicts directly to monastery gates. You watch in fascination as the monastery's peaceful rhythms collapse under military occupation. The chapel bells that once called monks to prayer now serve as alarm signals for troop movements. The scriptorium where brothers copied sacred texts transforms into a map room where officers plan artillery bombardments of neighbouring towns. The refectory, designed for silent contemplation, echoes with soldiers' songs, gambling disputes, and increasingly creative profanity that would make medieval devils blush with embarrassment. The economic devastation proves immediate and total. You observe how 200 soldiers consume the monastery's carefully accumulated food stores in less than a week, devouring provisions intended to last the monastic community through winter. The soldiers' horses graze the monastery's gardens into stubble, while their cooking fires consume wooden furniture that took craftsmen years to create. Captain von Stauffen promises eventual compensation from imperial coffers, but you notice his IOUs are written on paper that makes excellent kindling for the soldiers' campfires. You witness the monastery's transformation into an unwilling participant in military intelligence operations. Brother Thomas, whose linguistic skills made him valuable for translating theological texts, finds himself interrogating French prisoners about troop movements and supply lines. The monastery's extensive network of contacts throughout the region becomes a military asset as monks who once shared gossip about harvest conditions now provide strategic intelligence about enemy positions and local sentiment. The arrival of French forces 3 weeks later creates a nightmarish scenario that transforms the monastery into a contested battlefield. You observe the surreal spectacle of cannon fire exchanged across courtyards, where monks once processed in silent meditation. The ancient stone walls that provided spiritual protection for centuries prove woefully inadequate against Renaissance military technology. Artillery shells crash through the library roof, destroying manuscripts that survived Viking raids and political upheavals but couldn't withstand the evolution of warfare. Historians still argue whether monastic neutrality ever represented realistic policy or simply reflected the luxury of living in an era of limited warfare. You sense the truth reveals how fundamentally European conflict had changed by the 16th century. Wars no longer involved small professional armies fighting brief campaigns, but massive forces requiring extended supply lines and strategic positions that made truly neutral territory an impossible fantasy. You witness the human cost of military occupation as monks struggle to maintain religious routines amid organised violence. Brother Francis attempts to continue morning prayers while artillery practice shakes dust from chapel walls and interrupts Latin psalms with explosive punctuation. The spiritual discipline that once defined monastic life becomes impossible to maintain when daily schedules must accommodate military necessity rather than divine office requirements. The monastery's role as a refugee centre proves both spiritually meaningful and practically catastrophic. You observe hundreds of displaced villagers seeking sanctuary behind monastery walls as armies strip the countryside of resources and population. The monks' Christian obligation to provide hospitality becomes a death sentence when the monastery's infrastructure can't support the sudden population explosion. Disease spreads rapidly through overcrowded dormitories while food shortages create desperate competition between refugees and religious communities. You watch as military engineers systematically dismantle the monastery's defensive potential to prevent future military use. They fill in the wells, tear down portions of the walls, and destroy the gatehouse that once welcomed pilgrims but could also accommodate hostile forces. The monastery's physical structure, designed to provide security for contemplative life, becomes a liability in an era when any fortified position attracts military attention from multiple armies seeking strategic advantages. The psychological impact on surviving monks proves devastating beyond physical destruction. You observe Brother Augustine, who spent decades cultivating inner peace through contemplative prayer, struggling with traumatic memories of violence that shattered his spiritual sanctuary. The monastery's reputation as a refuge from worldly conflict becomes a cruel joke when warfare follows religious communities into their most sacred spaces, making nowhere safe from the chaos consuming European civilization. You witness the monastery's desperate attempts to rebuild after the armies depart, leaving behind devastation that would challenge modern reconstruction efforts. The monks survey collapsed buildings, contaminated wells, and fields sown with military debris rather than crops. The task of restoration seems impossible when the community lacks both resources and manpower to address damage that exceeds anything in the monastery's long history of surviving natural disasters and political upheavals. The regional impact of monastery destruction ripples through communities that depended on religious institutions for social services now impossible to provide. You observe how the collapse of monastic healthcare, education, and charitable operations creates cascading crises in areas already devastated by military campaigns. The villages that once relied on monastery support discover that secular authorities lack both interest and resources to replace services that religious communities provided automatically for centuries. You notice how warfare creates philosophical crises for monastic communities trying to reconcile Christian pacifism with military necessity. Some monks argue that defending their community and refugees represents legitimate Christian action, while others maintain that violence contradicts their fundamental vows regardless of circumstances. The theological debates become academic when survival requires practical decisions about cooperation with military forces that control local resources and protection. The transformation of monasteries into military targets fundamentally alters their relationship with secular authorities. You observe how princes and generals who once respected monastic neutrality now view religious communities as strategic assets to be controlled or destroyed based purely on military considerations. The monastery's spiritual purpose becomes irrelevant when its geographic position or resource base affects campaign planning and battlefield tactics. As you survey the smoking ruins and scattered communities left in warfare's wake, you understand that military conflict has accomplished something other pressures never achieved: the complete destruction of the physical and social infrastructure that made monastic life possible, where plague, poverty, and corruption weakened monasteries while leaving their basic structures intact. Warfare simply obliterates centuries of accumulated civilization, with the efficient brutality that only organised violence can achieve. You sense that this military devastation represents more than temporary setback. It demonstrates how the escalating scale of European warfare makes traditional monastic neutrality impossible to maintain in a world where armies treat everything as potential military resources. Do you remember watching armies obliterate centuries of monastic architecture with cannon fire and strategic demolition? Now you observe a quieter but equally profound transformation as the very foundations of medieval society shift beneath monastery walls like sand dunes, reshaped by persistent winds. The year is 1450, and you witness the emergence of universities, guilds, hospitals, and schools that begin providing services once monopolised by religious communities, a gradual but inexorable process that renders monasteries as obsolete as castle walls in an age of gunpowder. You watch as the newly founded University of Prague attracts students who once would have sought education exclusively in monastery schools. The contrast strikes you immediately, where monastic education focused on theological contemplation and the preservation of ancient texts. University scholars embrace empirical investigation and secular philosophy that challenges rather than confirms traditional religious authority. You observe young men choosing academic careers that promise social advancement through intellectual achievement rather than spiritual advancement through religious devotion. The university's lecture halls buzz with debates about natural philosophy, mathematics, and legal theory that explicitly reject monastic methods of understanding the world through scriptural interpretation and mystical contemplation. You witness Professor Johannes demonstrating anatomical dissection techniques that contradict monastery medical texts based on ancient authorities rather than direct observation. The monastery's reputation as a centre of learning crumbles as university scholars dismiss monastic scholarship as superstitious repetition rather than genuine intellectual inquiry. You observe the rise of merchant guilds that provide economic security and social identity once available only through religious communities. The Guild of Wool Merchants creates its own hospital for sick members, maintains schools for members' children, and operates charitable foundations that rival monastic social services. Master Wilhelm, a successful cloth trader, explains to his apprentices that guild membership offers practical benefits that monastic life promises only in the afterlife: job training, business connections, and retirement security based on mutual cooperation rather than divine providence. The guild system's emphasis on professional expertise and economic productivity creates compelling alternatives to monastic life for young men seeking meaningful careers. You watch as talented individuals who might once have entered monasteries for intellectual stimulation and social advancement now choose guild apprenticeships that promise material prosperity and practical skills. The monastery's role as a career path for ambitious commoners disappears as secular institutions offer better opportunities for social mobility. You witness the establishment of municipal hospitals that provide medical care without requiring patients to endure religious instruction or spiritual counselling. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew employs university-trained physicians who practice medicine based on empirical observation rather than theological theory. The contrast with monastery infirmaries becomes stark, where monastic medicine integrated prayer, penance, and herbal remedies. Secular hospitals focus exclusively on physical healing through rational treatment methods. The emergence of royal bureaucracies creates administrative careers that attract intellectuals once drawn to monastic life. You observe how kings and princes establish civil service systems that require the same literacy, numeracy, and organisational skills that monasteries traditionally provided. The Royal Chancellery offers ambitious scholars opportunities to influence political policy and accumulate personal wealth, while serving secular rather than spiritual masters. Historians still argue whether these social changes represented natural evolution or deliberate attempts to reduce church power. You sense the truth encompasses both dynamics, practical needs for more efficient institutions combined with political interests in limiting ecclesiastical influence over education, healthcare, and social services. The monastery closures that result from institutional competition serve multiple social functions while reducing religious communities to increasingly narrow spiritual roles. You watch as urban growth creates new forms of community organisation that compete directly with monastic fellowship. The city guilds, neighbourhood associations, and merchant companies provide social identity and mutual support without requiring celibacy or religious vows. You observe Master Thomas, a successful goldsmith, enjoying family life and professional achievement while participating in guild activities that offer the same sense of purpose and brotherhood that once made monastic life attractive. The printing press revolution transforms the monastery's role as a centre of learning and communication. You witness how printed books make manuscript copying obsolete virtually overnight, eliminating one of the monastery's most important economic and cultural functions. The monastery's scriptorium, once invaluable for preserving and transmitting knowledge, becomes an expensive anachronism when commercial printing houses can produce books faster, cheaper, and in greater quantities. You observe how printed materials democratize access to information that monasteries once controlled through their libraries and educational programs. Village priests can now purchase theological texts that previously required years of monastic study to access. Wealthy merchants buy classical literature and scientific treatises that make them as educated as university graduates. The monastery's monopoly on learning disappears as printed books make advanced education available to anyone with sufficient money and motivation. The development of banking systems provides financial services that replace monastic treasuries and lending operations. You watch as the Medici Bank establishes branches throughout Europe, offering credit, currency exchange, and investment opportunities that make monastery financial services seem primitive by comparison. The monastery's role as a safe repository for valuables and source of emergency loans becomes unnecessary when professional bankers provide the same services more efficiently and at competitive rates. You witness the emergence of charitable foundations established by wealthy merchants and nobles who want to support social causes without surrendering control to religious authorities. These secular philanthropies fund schools, hospitals, and relief programs that provide the same social services as monasteries, but operate under lay management guided by practical rather than spiritual considerations. The monastery's monopoly on organised charity disappears as secular institutions demonstrate equal or superior effectiveness in serving human needs. The rise of professional armies reduces the monastery's importance as a diplomatic neutral ground and safe haven during conflicts. You observe how standing military forces and professional officers create institutional alternatives to monastic mediation in political disputes. The monastery's traditional role in peace negotiations becomes obsolete when kings maintain permanent embassies and professional diplomatic corps that handle international relations without religious intermediation. You notice how changing agricultural practices reduce rural communities' dependence on monastic technical expertise and economic leadership. The emergence of scientific farming methods, improved livestock breeding, and commercial crop rotation techniques make monastery agricultural knowledge seem outdated and inefficient. Successful farmers now consult university-trained agronomists and exchange information through merchant networks rather than seeking guidance from monastic communities still using medieval farming methods. The development of insurance systems provides economic security that reduces individuals' reliance on monastic charity and community support. You watch as merchant associations create mutual insurance funds that protect members against business losses, maritime disasters, and family emergencies. These secular safety nets offer more reliable assistance than monastery charity, which depends on the institution's financial health and theological priorities rather than contractual obligations. You observe how urban entertainment industries provide cultural alternatives to the religious festivals and community celebrations once centred on monastic institutions. Professional musicians, theatrical companies, and tavern entertainments offer social activities that compete successfully with religious observances for public attention and participation. The monastery's role as a community cultural centre diminishes as secular entertainment options multiply and improve. As you survey the landscape of emerging secular institutions surrounding the increasingly isolated monastery, you understand that social change has accomplished something external pressures never achieved: the systematic replacement of monastic functions by more efficient and specialised alternatives, where plague, war, and corruption attacked monasteries directly. Institutional evolution simply makes them unnecessary by providing better options for education, healthcare, social services, and community organisation. You sense that this transformation represents more than temporary competition. It signals a fundamental shift in how European society organises itself, moving from religious institutions that serve multiple functions to secular specialists that focus on particular social needs with greater efficiency and effectiveness. Do you remember observing how secular institutions gradually assumed the social functions once monopolised by monasteries? Now you witness an even more fundamental collapse as the elaborate administrative systems that held monastic communities together for centuries begin falling apart like a clockwork mechanism with broken gears. You stand in the monastery's archive room watching Brother Marcus, the aging treasurer, stare helplessly at ledger books that haven't been properly maintained in 5 years, their pages filled with incomplete entries, mathematical errors, and records of transactions that no one can remember or verify. You observe the cascading failure of monastic organisation as the crisis of leadership combines with reduced personnel to create administrative chaos that would challenge modern bureaucratic systems, let alone medieval religious communities operating with quill pens and candlelight. The monastery that once managed complex networks for states, tenant farmers, craft workshops, and charitable operations now struggles to maintain basic records of daily expenses and income. Brother Marcus admits with embarrassed honesty that he is not entirely certain how many monks currently live in the community, because the population changes so frequently and record keeping has become so sporadic. The breakdown of central oversight from religious authorities accelerates the monastery's organisational collapse. You witness the arrival of a visitation committee from the bishop's office, or rather, you witness what should have been their arrival, as the 3 elderly clerks sent to conduct the inspection spend most of their time arguing about which monastery they're supposed to be evaluating. The ecclesiastical bureaucracy that once provided guidance, oversight, and coordination for hundreds of religious communities has itself succumbed to the same administrative entropy affecting individual monasteries. You watch as the monastery's complex system of appointed offices and rotating responsibilities disintegrates under the pressure of too few qualified people trying to maintain too many traditional functions. Brother Thomas serves simultaneously as librarian, treasurer, guest master, and infirmarian, a workload that would challenge a team of specialists but overwhelming for one aging monk whose expertise lies primarily in Latin grammar rather than institutional management. The careful specialisation that once made monasteries models of organisational efficiency becomes impossible when communities lack sufficient personnel to fill essential roles. The monastery's financial management reaches levels of dysfunction that would be comedic if the consequences weren't so serious. You observe Brother William attempting to reconcile accounts using mathematics that would make ancient Babylonians weep with frustration. His calculation methods involve counting on his fingers, making hash marks on slate tablets, and occasionally consulting an abacus that appears to have several missing beads. The monastery's budget planning consists primarily of hoping that divine providence will somehow balance expenses that consistently exceed income by margins that would bankrupt most secular institutions within months. You witness the breakdown of communication systems that once connected the monastery to its extensive network of properties, tenants, and business partners. Letters remain unanswered for months because no one remembers who holds responsibility for correspondence. Legal documents expire unnoticed, causing the monastery to lose property rights through simple administrative negligence. The monastery's tenant farmers send representatives to discuss lease renewals, but find no one competent to negotiate agreements or authorized to make binding commitments on the community's behalf. The deterioration of internal discipline creates operational chaos that compounds administrative problems. You observe monks ignoring assigned duties because no one maintains authority to enforce compliance or accountability. Brother Benedict spends his days cultivating an elaborate vegetable garden, while his official responsibility for maintaining the library results in manuscripts mouldering from neglect. The traditional monastic emphasis on obedience to legitimate authority becomes meaningless when no one can determine which authority remains legitimate or competent. Historians still argue whether monastic administrative collapse represented inevitable institutional decay or resulted from specific historical pressures that overwhelmed otherwise functional systems. You sense the truth encompasses both factors. Institutions designed for stable medieval conditions couldn't adapt quickly enough to handle the accelerating pace of social, economic, and religious change that characterized the late medieval and early modern periods. You witness the monastery's desperate attempts to maintain operations through increasingly improvised solutions that highlight rather than resolve underlying organizational problems. The brothers institute a rotating system of shared responsibilities that results in no one actually being responsible for anything. They attempt to simplify procedures by eliminating record-keeping requirements that seem burdensome, creating an information vacuum that makes rational decision-making impossible. Each solution creates new problems that require additional fixes, generating a spiral of administrative complexity that exhausts the community's limited intellectual and emotional resources. The breakdown of external relationships accelerates as the monastery's reputation for competent business practices evaporates. You observe merchants who once eagerly sought contracts with the monastery, now avoiding dealings with an institution that can't reliably deliver promised goods or services. The monastery's traditional role as a trusted intermediary in complex business transactions disappears when counterparts lose confidence in the community's ability to honor agreements or maintain confidential information. You watch as the monastery's educational functions collapse under administrative neglect. The famous school that once attracted students from across Europe closes because no one maintains enrollment records, collects tuition payments, or ensures that qualified teachers actually appear for classes. The library becomes inaccessible because no one catalogues new acquisitions or maintains lending procedures. The monastery's reputation for scholarly excellence becomes a historical artifact rather than a current reality. The legal complications created by administrative breakdown multiply exponentially as the monastery becomes vulnerable to lawsuits from creditors, tenants, and business partners who can't obtain satisfaction through normal channels. You observe courts attempting to sort through monastery records that exist in multiple contradictory versions, written in different hands, using inconsistent accounting methods, and stored without any organizational system. The legal expenses required to defend against claims resulting from administrative negligence consume resources that could have prevented the problems in the first place. You witness the psychological impact on individual monks as they watch their life's work crumble through institutional incompetence rather than external pressure. Brother Augustine, who spent decades building the monastery's reputation for reliable estate management, suffers visible anguish as properties are lost through paperwork errors and deadline oversights. The sense of purpose that sustained monastic life evaporates when daily activities consist primarily of crisis management, rather than spiritual development or meaningful service to others. The monastery's charitable operations cease not from lack of desire to help others, but from inability to organise effective assistance programs. You observe desperate villagers seeking help during harvest failures, but the monastery can't determine what resources are available for distribution or establish fair procedures for allocating limited supplies. The community's traditional role as a social safety net becomes impossible to fulfill when the institution lacks the administrative capacity to assess needs or coordinate responses. You notice how administrative breakdown creates opportunities for exploitation by individuals who understand the monastery's vulnerabilities. Local merchants present bills for goods never delivered, knowing that no one maintains adequate purchasing records. Tenant farmers claim they've already paid rents that were never properly recorded. Former employees demand wages for work periods that may or may not have occurred, backed by documentation that may or may not be authentic. As you survey the chaos of incomplete records, unfulfilled obligations, and abandoned procedures surrounding you, you understand that administrative collapse has accomplished something other pressures couldn't achieve: the complete destruction of institutional memory and operational capacity that took centuries to develop. Where external challenges attacked monasteries while leaving their organisational structures potentially recoverable, administrative breakdown eliminates the knowledge and procedures necessary for institutional survival, making recovery impossible even if external conditions improved. You sense that this organisational death represents the final stage of institutional decline, the point where monasteries cease functioning not because they lack resources or face external opposition, but because they can no longer remember how to operate effectively in any circumstances. Do you remember watching the monastery's internal organisation collapse into administrative chaos? Now you observe an even more direct assault on monastic survival as secular lords discover that legal manipulation and brute force can accomplish what centuries of religious respect prevented: the systematic seizure of monastery lands that represented the foundation of monastic economic independence. You witness Duke Robert's legal advisors arriving at the monastery gates with documents that transform centuries-old religious endowments into contested property through the creative application of inheritance law, debt collection, and political pressure. You watch as Master Geoffrey, the Duke's chief legal counsel, explains to the bewildered abbot how recent changes in royal law have invalidated the monastery's original land grants from previous monarchs. The legal argument proves remarkably sophisticated, since the monastery received its estates from kings who derived their authority from divine right, and since the current monarch has established royal supremacy over religious matters, all previous ecclesiastical grants require royal confirmation to remain valid. The monastery must now prove its right to own lands it has possessed for 400 years, using legal standards that didn't exist when the original donations were made. The sophistication of legal attacks on monastic property reveals how far secular jurisprudence has evolved beyond the simple feudal relationships that once protected religious institutions. You observe lawyers employing Roman law principles, canon law interpretations, and newly developed concepts of corporate identity to construct arguments that make monastery land ownership appear questionable, even when historical evidence clearly supports monastic claims. The legal system that once protected ecclesiastical property now provides tools for sophisticated theft disguised as judicial process. You witness the monastery's pathetic attempts to defend its property rights through legal channels designed to favour secular interests. Brother Thomas, whose legal training consists primarily of canon law and theological disputation, faces professional attorneys who understand secular court procedures, precedent systems, and judicial politics that operate according to completely different principles than ecclesiastical law. The abbot's appeals to tradition, papal authority, and moral obligation carry no weight in secular courts that recognise only royal prerogative and legal technicalities. The economic pressure tactics employed by land-hungry nobles prove as effective as legal manoeuvres in forcing monastery surrenders. You observe how Duke Robert's agents systematically disrupt the monastery's agricultural operations by claiming disputed ownership of access roads, water rights, and grazing areas essential for productive farming. The monastery's tenant farmers find themselves caught between competing legal claims that make normal agricultural operations impossible, forcing them to abandon their holdings rather than risk involvement in property disputes that could result in criminal charges. You watch as the monastery's creditors, encouraged by secular authorities who promise legal protection, demand immediate repayment of debts that were previously managed through flexible arrangements based on mutual trust and long-term relationships. The Lombard merchants who once accepted monastery IOUs backed by land values now insist on immediate cash payments or property seizures. Knowing that secular courts will enforce their claims regardless of the economic devastation imposed on religious communities, the military intimidation that accompanies legal pressure reveals how completely the traditional respect for ecclesiastical sanctuary has evaporated in the face of secular greed. You observe Duke Robert's soldiers conducting training exercises in fields adjacent to monastery property, their weapons and horses serving as not-so-subtle reminders of what happens to institutions that resist noble claims through purely legal channels, the monastery's ancient walls, designed to provide spiritual rather than military protection, offer no defense against professional soldiers operating with secular legal authorization. Historians still argue whether land seizures represented legitimate legal evolution or criminal conspiracy disguised as judicial process. You sense the truth reveals how political power ultimately determines legal interpretation, when valuable property interests conflict with abstract principles of justice or religious protection. The monastery seizures that result from legal manipulation serve both individual greed and broader political goals of reducing ecclesiastical independence from secular authority. You witness the monastery's desperate attempts to find political protection through appeals to higher authorities who prove either unwilling or unable to defend ecclesiastical property rights. The bishop's office offers sympathy but no practical assistance, explaining that interference in secular legal matters exceeds ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The royal court maintains that property disputes must be resolved through established legal channels that happen to favour secular interests over religious claims. The speed with which land seizures spread throughout the region demonstrates how quickly successful legal precedents encourage similar attacks on vulnerable targets. You observe neighbouring nobles studying Duke Robert's methods and adapting his legal strategies to their own territorial ambitions. The monastery's loss of property through judicial manipulation becomes a template for similar seizures that systematically strip religious institutions of their economic foundation throughout the kingdom. You watch as the monastery's traditional allies among local nobility abandon their support when defending ecclesiastical property rights, conflicts with their own opportunities for territorial expansion. Count William, whose family donated lands to the monastery for 5 generations, now claims that his ancestors' gifts exceeded their legal authority to dispose of hereditary estates. The legal argument conveniently ignores centuries of successful monastery management that improved the property's value and productivity. The psychological warfare employed alongside legal pressure proves particularly effective in breaking monastic resistance to property seizures. You observe how Duke Robert's agents spread rumours about monastery corruption, financial mismanagement, and political disloyalty that justify seizure as necessary reform rather than theft. The monastery's reputation for spiritual authority becomes a liability when secular propagandists reframe religious independence as dangerous resistance to legitimate political authority. You witness the monastery's internal divisions that develop as individual monks face personal consequences for continued resistance to secular pressure. Brother Marcus, responsible for the monastery's financial operations, receives private offers of employment and protection if he cooperates with property seizures by providing insider information about monastery assets and vulnerabilities. The community solidarity that once sustained monasteries through external challenges crumbles when individuals must choose between institutional loyalty and personal survival. The legal precedents established through monastery land seizures have implications far beyond individual religious communities. You observe how successful attacks on ecclesiastical property rights encourage similar challenges to other forms of corporate ownership that conflict with secular political interests. The legal principles used to justify monastery seizures will eventually threaten university endowments, guild properties, and municipal land grants that operate according to similar historical charters and traditional privileges. You notice how land seizures accelerate the monastery's broader institutional collapse by eliminating the economic foundation necessary for all other monastic activities. The educational, charitable, and spiritual functions that defined monastic life become impossible to maintain when the community lacks basic resources for survival. The monastery's famous library becomes worthless when there's no money for heating fuel to prevent manuscript decay during winter months. The regional economic disruption caused by monastery land seizures extends far beyond the religious communities directly affected. You watch as agricultural productivity declines when professional farm management by experienced monastic administrators is replaced by noble exploitation focused on short-term profit extraction rather than long-term land stewardship. The monastery's tenant farmers face increased rents, reduced services, and arbitrary treatment that drives many to abandon agriculture entirely. You observe how successful land seizures eliminate potential sources of resistance to secular authority by removing institutions that provided alternative centres of power and legitimacy within medieval society. The monastery's traditional role as a mediating institution between royal authority and local communities disappears when religious institutions become entirely dependent on secular protection for their basic survival. As you survey the empty fields and abandoned buildings that once supported thriving monastic communities, you understand that land seizures accomplish something other pressures never achieved: the complete elimination of the economic independence that made monastic resistance to secular pressure possible. Where external challenges tested monastic resourcefulness and adaptability, property seizures simply remove the material foundation necessary for institutional survival under any circumstances. You sense that these seizures represent more than isolated criminal acts. They signal a fundamental shift in the balance of power between religious and secular authorities that will reshape European civilization for centuries to come. Do you remember watching secular lords systematically seize monastery lands through legal manipulation and military intimidation? Now you witness the final, most heartbreaking chapter as the last truly devoted monks face the impossible decision between abandoning their sacred calling and watching their beloved community die around them. The year is 1580, and you observe Brother Benedict, whose family has served this monastery for 7 generations, carefully packing his few remaining possessions while tears stream down his weathered cheeks. Not tears of defeat, but of profound grief for a way of life that sustained his ancestors through centuries of change but cannot survive the convergence of forces now destroying European monasticism. You watch the agonizing process as individual monks confront the reality that their personal devotion cannot sustain institutional collapse. Brother Francis, who has spent 40 years perfecting his illuminated manuscripts and never doubted his monastic vocation, stares at the empty scriptorium where broken windows let in rain that warps his precious parchments and ruins inks that cost more than most peasants earn in a year. His choice crystallizes with brutal clarity: remain in a monastery that can no longer function as a monastery, or carry his faith into an uncertain world that has moved beyond the medieval assumptions that made monastic life meaningful. The conversations between departing monks reveal the profound spiritual crisis created by institutional collapse. You listen as Brother Thomas and Brother Augustine debate whether their monastic vows bind them to remain in a community that no longer exists in any meaningful sense, or whether their higher obligation to serve God requires them to seek other paths for spiritual expression. The theological complexity of their situation would challenge medieval scholastics. Do monastic vows create permanent obligations to specific institutions? Or do they represent broader commitments to Christian service that might be fulfilled through different means? You observe the practical preparations for departure that make abstract theological discussions painfully concrete. Brother Marcus divides his personal books among departing brothers, keeping only a breviary and a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict that he can carry in his travelling pack. The monastery's famous library, once containing thousands of volumes, reduces to a handful of texts that individual monks can preserve through personal ownership. Centuries of accumulated learning fragment into private collections that may never be reunited or made accessible to future scholars. The final religious services conducted in the monastery chapel carry emotional weight that transcends normal liturgical experience. You witness the celebration of Mass by candlelight in a building where broken windows and collapsed roof sections let in autumn rain that pools on altar stones consecrated 600 years earlier. The handful of remaining monks sing Latin hymns with voices that echo through mostly empty halls, their devotion intensified rather than diminished by the knowledge that they're performing these rituals for the last time in this sacred space. You watch as Brother Benedict makes his final rounds through buildings that housed his entire adult life, touching walls where generations of monks carved devotional inscriptions, visiting cells where saints and scholars spent decades in prayer and study, standing in gardens where monastic botanists cultivated both food and medicine for surrounding communities. His pilgrimage through the empty monastery becomes a physical prayer, an embodied farewell to spaces sanctified by centuries of human devotion to divine service. The distribution of monastery treasures among departing monks reflects both practical necessity and spiritual symbolism. You observe as sacred vessels, religious artworks, and precious manuscripts are carefully allocated among brothers who will carry them into secular world as tangible connections to their dissolved community. Brother William receives the monastery's most beautiful chalice, not because he has special claim to it, but because his nephew serves as a parish priest who can ensure its continued liturgical use rather than secular sale or destruction. Historians still argue whether these final departures represented tragic abandonment or courageous adaptation to impossible circumstances. You sense the truth encompasses both interpretations. These monks genuinely believed in their monastic calling but recognized that maintaining spiritual integrity sometimes requires abandoning institutional forms that no longer serve their intended purpose. Their departure represents not failure of faith, but evolution of faith expression in response to changing historical conditions. You witness the profound psychological adjustment required as lifelong monastics prepare to navigate secular world they have avoided for decades. Brother Augustine, who entered the monastery as a teenager and spent 30 years in religious community, must now learn to manage personal finances, maintain secular relationships, and make individual decisions without the communal support system that structured his entire adult existence. The monastery's protective environment, once viewed as spiritual advantage, becomes practical liability when monks must function independently in competitive secular society. The networking among departing monks creates informal connections that preserve aspects of monastic community even after formal dissolution. You observe as brothers exchange contact information and make plans for periodic reunions that will maintain their spiritual fellowship despite geographic separation. Some discuss establishing new religious communities in regions where monastery life might still be possible, while others plan to serve as parish priests or religious teachers who will carry monastic wisdom into new contexts. You watch as the monks' final preparations reveal the depth of their attachment to routine and structure that defined monastic existence. Brother Francis carefully transcribes the daily prayer schedule that regulated his spiritual life for 4 decades, planning to maintain these devotional practices even without communal support. Brother Thomas packs seeds from the monastery garden, hoping to cultivate herbs and vegetables that will provide tangible connections to the agricultural work that once balanced his scholarly pursuits. The emotional farewells between departing brothers demonstrate bonds forged through shared spiritual discipline and common purpose. You witness embraces that last several minutes, promises to continue praying for each other's spiritual welfare, and exchanges of small gifts that carry symbolic rather than material value. Brother Benedict gives Brother William a stone from the monastery's foundation, while Brother Augustine presents Brother Francis with a pen he used for manuscript copying, tokens that will remind them of their shared commitment to monastic ideals even in secular contexts. You observe the final administrative tasks that transform institutional dissolution into legal reality. Brother Marcus, serving as the last treasurer, distributes remaining monastery funds among departing members and settles final debts with local creditors. The monastery's official seal is broken and buried in the chapel floor, symbolically ending the community's legal existence as a corporate entity. These practical necessities carry profound symbolic weight as legal formalities mark the end of institutional continuity that stretched back through centuries of continuous religious life. The regional impact of monastery closures becomes apparent as departing monks seek new positions in secular world unprepared to absorb their specialized skills and knowledge. You watch as former monastics discover that their expertise in theology, manuscript copying, herbal medicine, and contemplative prayer has limited market value in societies increasingly focused on commercial enterprise and practical technology. Some find positions as private tutors or secretaries, while others struggle with unemployment that forces them to learn entirely new skills in middle age. You notice how departing monks carry forward aspects of monastic culture that will influence secular institutions and religious practices throughout Europe. Former monastics serving as parish priests introduce congregations to liturgical music, theological scholarship, and charitable practices developed through centuries of monastic experience. The monastery's dissolution spreads its accumulated wisdom through diaspora rather than concentration, potentially reaching broader audiences than institutional monasticism ever achieved. As you watch the last monks walking away from monastery gates that will never again open for a religious community, you understand that these departures represent both ending and transformation. The institutional framework that sustained European monasticism for over a millennium has collapsed, but the spiritual insights, practical wisdom, and devotional practices developed within monastery walls will continue influencing European religious and cultural life through different channels and new contexts. You sense that these final faithful departures mark not just the end of medieval monasticism, but the beginning of new forms of religious expression adapted to early modern European society that values individual choice, personal responsibility, and spiritual diversity over institutional conformity and communal discipline. Do you remember watching the last devoted monks walking away from their beloved monastery, carrying centuries of wisdom into an uncertain world? Now you stand alone in the profound silence that follows human departure, surrounded by empty stone halls where only echoes remain to testify to the countless prayers, scholarly debates, and acts of charity that once filled these spaces with purpose and meaning. The autumn wind whistles through broken windows where stained glass once cast coloured light across floors now littered with fallen leaves, and you realise you're witnessing the transformation of living community into historical artefact, a process as natural and inevitable as the seasons themselves, yet infinitely more poignant. You observe how quickly nature reclaims spaces that humans defended against wilderness for centuries. Vines creep through cracks in the chapel walls, where master masons once fitted stones with mathematical precision that challenged the engineering capabilities of their age. Birds nest in the bell tower where bronze bells once called monks to prayer across miles of countryside, their melodic chimes now replaced by the harsh cries of ravens that show no respect for the sacred purposes these structures once served. The monastery garden, once a masterpiece of botanical organisation where monks cultivated both medicinal herbs and contemplative beauty, reverts to wild meadow where deer graze among the ruins of carefully planned flower beds. The physical decay proceeds with relentless logic as weather and time accomplish what human enemies never could. The systematic destruction of architectural achievements that represented the pinnacle of medieval craftsmanship. You watch as winter storms tear at the monastery's roof, allowing rain and snow to penetrate buildings designed to last until the Second Coming. The famous library, once climate-controlled through ingenious systems of air circulation, becomes a casualty of moisture damage that warps wooden shelves and destroys manuscripts that survived Viking raids. Political upheavals and religious wars but cannot withstand simple neglect. You witness the tragic irony of preservation efforts by local villagers who understand the monastery's historical importance but lack resources or expertise to maintain complex medieval architecture. Well-meaning attempts to patch roof damage with modern materials create new problems as incompatible building techniques accelerate structural deterioration. The villagers' efforts to preserve the monastery's chalices and religious artifacts often result in damage caused by improper handling and storage, highlighting the specialized knowledge required to maintain medieval treasures that monastics developed through centuries of experience. The monastery's transformation into local legend begins almost immediately as stories replace lived reality and community memory. You observe how villagers who once interacted daily with monks begin romanticizing monastic life within months of the community's dissolution, forgetting the tensions and conflicts that characterized actual monastery-village relationships. The monks become saintly figures in popular stories that emphasize their wisdom, charity, and devotion while minimizing the human struggles and institutional failures that contributed to the monastery's collapse. The emergence of ghost stories and supernatural legends reflects the psychological difficulty of accepting that institutions once considered permanent can simply disappear. You notice how quickly local folklore develops explanations for strange sounds and unexplained phenomena in the empty buildings. Tales of ghostly monks continuing their prayers, phantom bells ringing at midnight, and mysterious lights appearing in abandoned chapels. These stories serve important psychological functions by maintaining emotional connections to spaces that retain spiritual significance even after their religious purpose has ended. You watch as the empty monastery becomes a destination for travellers seeking romantic ruins that satisfy emerging aesthetic preferences for picturesque decay and historical melancholy. Artists arrive to sketch the monastery's crumbling walls and overgrown courtyards, transforming institutional failure into objects of beauty that appeal to sensibilities shaped by changing ideas about nature, history, and artistic inspiration. The monastery's suffering becomes entertainment for visitors who appreciate Gothic atmosphere without experiencing the human cost of institutional collapse. The archaeological value of abandoned monasteries becomes apparent as scholars begin studying medieval life through material remains left behind by departed communities. You observe antiquarians cataloguing architectural features, collecting pottery fragments, and documenting building techniques that represent lost knowledge about medieval craftsmanship and daily life. The monastery stones become primary sources for understanding historical periods that left few written records about practical aspects of religious community organization. Historians still argue whether monastery ruins should be preserved as historical monuments or allowed to decay naturally as part of ongoing historical processes. You sense the truth reveals fundamental tensions between honouring the past and accepting change as natural aspects of human experience. The monastery's stones will outlast the civilization that built them, but their meaning transforms continuously as new generations interpret medieval ruins through contemporary perspectives and needs. You witness the gradual integration of monastery ruins into new patterns of land use and economic activity. Local farmers discover that monastery stones provide excellent building material for barns and houses, leading to systematic dismantling of medieval architecture for practical purposes. The monastery's carefully cultivated fields return to agricultural production under secular management that focuses on commercial crops rather than the subsistence farming that sustained religious communities. The land retains its fertility while losing its spiritual associations. The monastery's influence on regional architecture persists through building techniques and decorative styles that local craftsmen learned from monastic construction projects. You observe how village churches built after the monastery's dissolution incorporate architectural elements inspired by the abbey's design, creating visible continuities between medieval religious architecture and early modern secular building. The monastery's aesthetic legacy survives its institutional death through cultural transmission that operates independently of conscious historical preservation efforts. You notice how the monastery's educational influence continues affecting regional literacy and intellectual culture long after the school closed and the library dispersed. Former monastery students who learn to read and write in monastic classrooms become teachers, clerks, and administrators in secular institutions that benefit from educational foundation provided by religious community. The monastery's intellectual legacy spreads through human networks rather than institutional continuity, reaching broader populations than the original monastic school ever served directly. The monastery's charitable traditions influence local approaches to poverty relief and social welfare even after the community's dissolution. You watch as village organisations adopt modified versions of monastic practices for caring for the sick, feeding the hungry, and housing travellers, adapting religious charitable methods to secular contexts that lack the theological framework that originally justified these activities. The monastery's compassionate practices survive in altered forms that serve similar human needs through different institutional structures. The silence that pervades the empty monastery carries different meanings for different visitors who bring their own interpretations to spaces once filled with purposeful activity. You observe how contemplatives find spiritual inspiration in ruins that remind them of life's transience and the importance of focusing on eternal rather than temporal concerns. Historical scholars hear echoes of past conversations and debates that shaped European intellectual development. Artists discover aesthetic beauty in decay that reveals the romantic appeal of human ambition humbled by natural forces. The seasonal changes that transform the monastery's appearance throughout the year create ongoing dialogue between human achievement and natural processes that ultimately reclaim all human construction. You watch as spring wildflowers bloom in the chapel nave where monks once prostrated themselves in prayer. Summer heat cracks stone foundations that survived medieval winters, and autumn leaves accumulate in cloisters designed for contemplative walking. Each season adds new layers of meaning to spaces that continue evolving long after their original purposes ended. As you stand in the gathering twilight surrounded by stones that will outlast empires while serving no purpose beyond bearing witness to human aspiration and inevitable change, you understand that these ruins represent both ending and continuity. The monastery's physical presence ensures that its story continues being told, even as the meaning of that story changes with each generation that encounters these silent stones and interprets their significance through contemporary perspectives shaped by different values, needs, and dreams. You sense that the monastery's silence speaks more eloquently than words, about the relationship between human ambition and historical change, reminding all who visit that even the most sacred and permanent-seeming institutions remain subject to forces larger than human will or divine protection. Do you remember standing among those silent ruins, where only wind and wildlife disturbed the profound quiet of abandoned holiness? Now you witness a remarkable resurrection as those empty stone halls fill once again with human voices and purposeful activity. Though the prayers have been replaced by children's laughter, the Latin chants by lessons in mathematics and literature, and the contemplative silence by the bustling energy of secular institutions breathing new life into medieval architecture. The year is 1650, and you observe how abandoned monasteries become the foundation for schools, hospitals, civic buildings, and private estates that serve the very communities once supported by monastic charity and wisdom. You watch as Master William Thompson, a progressive educator influenced by humanist philosophy, transforms the monastery's former scriptorium into a remarkable classroom where village children learn to read using printed books, rather than hand-copied manuscripts. The desks arranged in neat rows occupy spaces where monks once laboured over illuminated texts, and the large windows that provided natural light for manuscript copying now illuminate young minds discovering knowledge through methods that would have seemed revolutionary to medieval monastics. The irony strikes you as profound. The monastery's dedication to learning continues through completely different approaches to education that emphasize individual inquiry rather than institutional authority. The monastery's conversion into Thornfield Academy demonstrates how medieval architecture adapts surprisingly well to modern educational needs. You observe how the long dormitory halls, originally designed to house dozens of sleeping monks, provide excellent accommodations for boarding students whose families live too far from the school for daily commuting. The refectory where monks once ate in contemplative silence becomes a dining hall that buzzes with adolescent conversation about everything except spiritual matters. The chapel, too sacred to convert to secular use, serves as an assembly hall where students gather for morning announcements and graduation ceremonies that celebrate intellectual rather than religious achievement. You witness the remarkable success of the Academy's medical training program, established in the monastery's former infirmary where monks once treated patients using herbal remedies and prayer. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of Europe's first female physicians, teaches anatomy using cadavers in the same rooms where Brother Thomas once relied on ancient texts and divine intervention to treat plague victims. The continuity strikes you as remarkable. The same stone walls that witness centuries of religious healing now echo with scientific discussions about circulation, infection, and surgical techniques that represent genuine advances in human knowledge rather than repetition of medieval authorities. The monastery's agricultural lands undergo transformation that honours the monk's practical wisdom while embracing new scientific methods. You observe how the Academy's experimental farm builds upon centuries of monastic agricultural experience, using the same fertile fields and water management systems that sustained religious community while testing crop rotation techniques, selective breeding programs, and mechanical innovations that increase productivity beyond anything the monks achieved. The land continues serving educational purposes. Those students now learn botany and animal husbandry through empirical observation rather than theological interpretation of natural phenomena. The adaptive reuse of monastic buildings reveals remarkable architectural flexibility that medieval designers probably never anticipated. You watch as the monastery's chapter house, where monks once gathered for community meetings and spiritual instruction, becomes the Academy's library featuring floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that house thousands of printed volumes representing the explosion of knowledge that followed the invention of movable type. The reading tables occupy spaces where abbots once delivered homilies, creating literal continuities between medieval scholarship and modern learning that honour the intellectual tradition while transforming its methods and purposes. You notice how the monastery's conversion preserves important architectural and artistic heritage that might otherwise have been lost to neglect or deliberate destruction. The Academy's administrators commission skilled craftsmen to restore damaged frescoes, repair stained glass windows, and maintain stone carvings that represent masterpieces of medieval artistry. These preservation efforts serve aesthetic and educational purposes rather than religious devotion, but they ensure that future generations can appreciate the artistic achievements of monastic communities, even if they can't experience their spiritual practices. The social impact of the monastery's transformation extends far beyond the immediate educational benefits provided by the Academy. You observe how the school's presence attracts families, merchants, and professionals to the region, creating economic opportunities that more than compensate for the loss of monastic employment and charitable services. The Academy becomes a regional centre for intellectual and cultural activity that stimulates local commerce, encourages infrastructure development, and provides career opportunities for educated individuals who might otherwise seek employment in distant cities. Historians still argue whether monastery conversions represent cultural progress or historical loss, preservation of heritage or destruction of sacred purpose. You sense the truth encompasses both perspectives. These transformations save important architectural and institutional knowledge while fundamentally altering the meaning and function of spaces designed for specific religious purposes. The monastery's conversion serves human needs while changing the definition of service from spiritual to secular categories. You witness how the Academy's success inspires similar conversions throughout Europe as secular authorities recognize the practical advantages of adapting existing monastic infrastructure to modern institutional needs. The monastery buildings provide ready-made facilities for schools, hospitals, government offices, and cultural institutions that would be expensive and time-consuming to construct from scratch. The monks' emphasis on functional design and durable construction makes their buildings surprisingly suitable for secular adaptation, though the spiritual atmosphere requires conscious effort to maintain or deliberately alter. The psychological impact on local communities reveals complex relationships between past and present, as familiar buildings serve radically different purposes. You observe elderly villagers who remember the monastery's religious functions, expressing mixed feelings about seeing children play games in courtyards where monks once processed in silent prayer. Some appreciate the continued vitality and human activity, while others mourn the loss of sacred atmosphere that once made these spaces feel different from ordinary secular buildings. You watch as the Academy develops traditions and ceremonies that create new forms of institutional identity, while acknowledging historical continuity with the monastery's legacy. The annual Founders' Day celebration honours both the medieval monks who built the institution and the modern educators who transformed it, creating narrative connections between past and present that help students understand their place in ongoing historical development rather than viewing themselves as complete breaks from previous generations. The monastery's library collection, dispersed during dissolution but partially reassembled through systematic acquisition, becomes the foundation for the Academy's research capabilities that support both undergraduate education and advanced scholarship. You notice how medieval manuscripts share shelf space with modern scientific treatises, creating intellectual dialogues between historical and contemporary knowledge that enrich both teaching and learning in ways that purely modern institutions might struggle to achieve. The conversion's economic model demonstrates sustainable approaches to heritage preservation that benefit from rather than burden contemporary society. You observe how tuition payments from wealthy families subsidize scholarships for deserving students from poor backgrounds, creating social mobility opportunities that honor the monastery's charitable mission while operating according to market principles rather than religious obligation. The Academy generates sufficient revenue to maintain the medieval buildings while providing educational services that justify the institutional transformation. You witness the emergence of alumni networks that create professional and social connections extending far beyond the local community where the Monastery Academy is located. Former students establish careers in medicine, law, commerce, and government throughout Europe, carrying with them educational experiences shaped by the unique atmosphere of learning in medieval buildings designed for contemplation and study. The monastery's influence spreads through human networks that operate according to secular rather than religious principles, but achieve geographic reach comparable to medieval monastic orders. The Academy's research programs contribute to scientific and scholarly advances that represent genuine progress in human knowledge while maintaining continuity with the monastery's commitment to learning and intellectual inquiry. You observe professors conducting experiments in natural philosophy, developing new teaching methods, and publishing books that advance European intellectual development in directions the medieval monks could never have imagined, but would probably have appreciated as extensions of their own scholarly work. As you survey the thriving educational community that has grown from monastic ruins, you understand that institutional transformation can preserve essential human values while adapting to changing historical circumstances. The monastery's dedication to learning, service, and community welfare continues through completely different organizational structures and methods, proving that human ideals can survive institutional death when new generations find creative ways to honor past achievements while meeting contemporary needs. Do you remember watching medieval monasteries transform into thriving schools and hospitals that preserved their essential mission of human service through secular means? Now you find yourself in the 21st century, standing in a modern university lecture hall where Professor Sarah Mitchell teaches a course called Institutional Resilience and Organizational Change to graduate students who have never experienced the stability that medieval people took for granted, but understand instinctively the anxiety of living through rapid transformation. The PowerPoint slides behind her display familiar images: empty factory buildings in Detroit, abandoned shopping malls in suburban America, closed newspapers across the country, and you realize that the monastery dissolutions you witnessed centuries ago provide a lens for understanding how modern institutions rise, flourish, and disappear in patterns that transcend any particular historical period. You observe how Professor Mitchell uses medieval monastic history to help her students understand contemporary organizational challenges that seem unprecedented but actually follow patterns established long before anyone imagined global corporations, digital disruption, or artificial intelligence. The monasteries struggle with economic pressure, leadership corruption, external interference, and technological change mirrors the challenges facing modern institutions trying to adapt to market forces, regulatory changes, social media criticism, and automation that threatens traditional employment models. The same fundamental tensions between institutional mission and survival necessity that emptied medieval monasteries now challenge universities, hospitals, newspapers, and retail chains throughout the developed world. You witness how the monastic experience illuminates modern discussions about institutional purpose and social responsibility. The MBA students in Professor Mitchell's seminar debate whether corporations should prioritize shareholder profits or stakeholder welfare, unconsciously echoing medieval arguments about whether monasteries should focus on individual salvation or community service. The tension between institutional self-preservation and public mission that destroyed many monasteries appears throughout contemporary business ethics, non-profit management, and government policy discussions that struggle with similar competing obligations and limited resources. The digital revolution's impact on traditional institutions provides striking parallels to the printing press's effect on medieval monasteries. You observe how online education challenges university business models, just as printed books eliminated the monastery's monopoly on manuscript production and scholarly communication. The newspaper industry's collapse mirrors the scriptorium's obsolescence. While streaming services devastate movie theatres using the same logic that made monastery libraries seem unnecessary once books became widely available through commercial publishers. The pattern repeats across industries. Technological innovation eliminates institutional middlemen who previously controlled access to information, entertainment, or services. You notice how modern discussions about disruption and creative destruction echo the language used to describe monastic dissolution, though contemporary observers rarely acknowledge the human cost of institutional change. The venture capitalists who celebrate startups destroying established industries sound remarkably similar to 16th century reformers who justified monastery seizures as necessary modernization. Both groups emphasize efficiency gains and consumer benefits while minimizing the unemployment, community disruption, and cultural loss that accompany rapid institutional change. The rhetoric of progress masks consistent patterns of winners and losers that transcend specific historical periods. The psychological impact of institutional collapse proves remarkably consistent across centuries as individuals whose identities depend on organizational membership struggle to adapt when their institutions disappear or transform beyond recognition. You observe how former newspaper employees facing industry downsizing experience the same disorientation that monks felt when their monasteries closed: the sudden irrelevance of specialized skills, the loss of professional community, and the challenge of rebuilding careers in unfamiliar environments. The coal miners whose jobs disappeared due to environmental regulation, the retail workers displaced by online shopping, and the factory employees replaced by automation all face versions of the adaptation challenges that medieval monastics encountered when their institutional world collapsed. You witness how contemporary discussions about job retraining and social safety nets echo medieval debates about providing for displaced monks and monastery employees. The modern emphasis on lifelong learning and career flexibility reflects the same recognition that institutional change requires personal adaptation that characterized 16th century advice to former monastics. Government programs supporting displaced workers serve similar functions to the pensions offered to cooperative monks during dissolution. Though modern benefit systems operate through secular bureaucracies rather than royal patronage, the persistence of institutional functions despite organizational disappearance provides hopeful parallels between monastic dissolution and contemporary change. You observe how the essential services once provided by monasteries, education, healthcare, social welfare, and cultural preservation, survived institutional collapse through adaptation to new organizational forms. Similarly, the functions performed by declining modern institutions often migrate to new platforms and structures that serve similar human needs through different methods and business models. Online platforms provide information services once dominated by newspapers, while streaming services deliver entertainment previously controlled by movie studios and television networks. Historians still argue whether institutional change represents inevitable evolution or avoidable destruction of valuable social resources. You sense the truth encompasses both perspectives. Some institutional deaths result from failures of imagination or leadership that might have been prevented, while others reflect deeper historical forces that make organizational transformation necessary regardless of management quality or stakeholder resistance. The monastery dissolutions that appeared catastrophic to contemporary observers ultimately contributed to European intellectual and economic development that benefited broader populations than the original institutions ever served. You watch how Professor Mitchell's students struggle with the same questions about institutional loyalty and personal adaptation that faced medieval monks during dissolution crises. The graduate students planning careers in industries facing digital disruption must choose between loyalty to established organisations and pursuit of opportunities in emerging fields that might offer better long-term prospects. Their decisions reflect the same tensions between stability and change, tradition and innovation, that characterised monastic responses to institutional crisis throughout the late medieval period. The globalisation of institutional change accelerates patterns that medieval monastics experienced only within regional or national contexts. You observe how economic pressures, technological innovations, and regulatory changes now spread across continents within months rather than decades, creating institutional challenges that occur simultaneously rather than sequentially. The interconnectedness that characterises modern economic and social systems means that institutional collapse in one sector or region quickly affects organisations throughout the global network, amplifying both the speed and scale of change beyond anything medieval communities ever experienced. You notice how modern preservation efforts for historic monasteries reflect changing attitudes toward institutional memory and cultural heritage that would have seemed strange to people experiencing actual dissolution. The tourism industry that markets monastery ruins as romantic destinations, the academic programs that study monastic history, and the restoration projects that maintain medieval